Welcome to my segment, The World's Most Evil Companies, where I review each episode what I think are the world's most evil companies of all time. This week is going to be hard to top, but luckily, the world is pretty evil. Bayer is my most evil company of all time this week. Now, you may know Bayer as the German pharmaceutical company that invented aspirin, or the company that just merged with Monsanto. Now, people are aware of how evil Monsanto is, but Monsanto's merger with Bayer hardly makes Bayer any more evil. It's like telling a morbidly obese person to not eat ice cream. It won't make a difference. Now let's backtrack to Bayer's past before World War II, when it was known as IG Farben. Despite Germany losing World War I and its struggling economic state, German chemical companies were thriving, because people being poor and sick is great for business. IG Farben's executives plotted on how to take over the European chemical industry and then the world, but they needed a pawn, and Ronald Reagan was American and only a teenager at the time, so they found Hitler. And just like Reagan, all the interests and goals of the richest people in Hitler's country somehow became the goals and interests of Hitler.
Yes, Doctor, I'll remember. While his cold lasts, he should stay in bed, drink plenty of fluids, and take aspirin.
And take aspirin.
IG Farben was the largest financier of Hitler and the Nazis' rise to power. In return, Hitler and the Nazis later gave IG Farben enough money to make large industrial complexes and factories, what we now know as concentration camps. But there was a serious labor shortage because all the laborers, the males, were at war, and they're Nazis, so they're not going to let women work. Part of the motivation to make Jews scapegoats was so that they could become slaves at IG Farben concentration camps. Racism is the fuel for the vehicle of greed. We all know Auschwitz, the concentration camp, but very few know that it was built because it was connected via railway to the nearby Auschwitz IG Farben factory, which concentration camp slaves built as well. It's ironic that Nazis portrayed Jews as being greedy when they made money off of our slave labor. It's kind of like how white slave owners portrayed black people as being lazy. Basically, white slave owners project. When we see pictures of the concentration camps, we see torture and genocide. When IG Farben looked at the concentration camps, all they saw was money and profit. There is nothing cheaper than slave labor.
So take Bayer aspirin for fast relief whenever painful cold discomfort.
Most people know of Zyklon B, which one of IG Farben's companies created to gas Jews in the concentration camps. What most people don't know was Zyklon B was an insecticide that was widely used throughout Europe, just like we use Roundup today. See, Monsanto? Bayer's been doing this before you punks existed. IG Farben used concentration camp slave labor to make Zyklon B. Then Hitler and the Nazis bought Zyklon B from IG Farben to gas the workers. Pure profit. Capitalism at its finest.
And so quickly absorbed that Bayer is ready to go to work instantly.
We've all heard of Dr. Mengele and his twin studies, but that overshadows the real evil that was occurring. Bayer scientists were paid to conduct unethical research on concentration camp slaves for very profitable drugs that we still use today. The first versions of HIV and chemotherapy drugs that descend from modern versions that we use today were first tested on Holocaust victims, and Bayer were to go on to profit immensely from this. Profiting off of AIDS and cancer sounds like the final solution of poor people. HIV and chemotherapy drugs are primarily used on poor brown people, so the Fourth Reich is still creating the master race long after World War II.
The one thing doctors repeatedly specify is aspirin.
Now, we all know how World War II ended, and we've heard of the Nuremberg trials, Most people have only heard of one Nuremberg trial. There were 13, but we only hear about the first one, where the United States and Allied forces sentenced the highest-ranking German military officers to death. But the sixth Nuremberg trial, where they prosecuted the executives of IG Farben, was much different, even though the chief US prosecutor said that without IG Farben, the Second World War would have probably never happened. Now, most of these men were convicted, but their sentences would make Brock Turner's sentence look like justice. For instance, Otto Ambrose, IG Farben executive and head of the Chemical Warfare Committee, convicted to mass murder and slavery and crimes against humanity, sentenced to 8 years, released in 4. Went on to work as an executive for such American chemical companies as W.R. Grace, Dow Chemical, which would create Agent Orange to use on Vietnamese people, and the American Army, if the connection wasn't obvious enough to you yet. This guy was a key member of the Holocaust, and he went on to live until the year I was born. Or what about Fritz der Beer, IG Farben executive and the creator of the Auschwitz concentration camp, convicted of slavery and mass murder, sentenced to 7 years, released after 2. Michael Vick did more time than this guy. The Holocaust lasted 8 years. America, here's a tip. Next time you convict somebody of slavery and mass murder, make the sentence longer than the period of slavery and mass murder. He went on to be the head of Bayer for 8 years. Bayer said, "We know how profitable Auschwitz was, and we know you have the experience to do the same for us." Nothing ever happened to the IG Farben executives, but don't worry, IG Farben paid a dear price, an entire $27 million to the victims of the Holocaust, but said that paying was not an admission of guilt. Not an admission of guilt? I never thought a Holocaust denier would be someone who was caught red-handed starting the Holocaust. $27 million for the atrocities of the Holocaust, and you called Jews cheap. After the Nuremberg trials, IG Farben would be split up into 3 of its biggest companies, Hochta, BASF, and Bayer. All 3 in 20 years would go on to be bigger than IG Farben ever was. And Bayer was the biggest of them all. I can hear the skeptics now. Eric, Bayer is so different now, even though the guy Bayer hired to run the company was the Nazi who constructed Auschwitz. Bayer has had too many post-war scandals to tell here, but there are 2 modern examples that point to how little they've distanced themselves from their Nazi roots. In 2011, Bayer admitted to giving HIV-contaminated blood to hemophiliacs in 1980. Bayer also admitted to selling those same people HIV drugs because you gotta get new customers somehow. Bayer thought Americans were so stupid that if they didn't report it to the English-speaking media, that we wouldn't hear about it until the outrage was over. They were right. Bayer paid $50 million, which to them is almost 2 Holocausts. Bayer said their company motto, "Paying is not an admission of guilt," but I have come up with a better commercial for them. Bayer, we make a killing off of AIDS, cancer, and the Holocaust. Which brings me to Bayer's most recent scandal, Essure, Bayer's permanent birth control for women. What could possibly go wrong? Let's watch the commercial.
What if I got pregnant again? Everything would change.
Do you ever worry about unplanned pregnancy? Now there's a way to push away those worries. If you know you're done having children, maybe it's time for Essure, a simple permanent birth control solution performed in a doctor's office in less than an hour without hormones, cutting, or the risks of getting your tubes tied. Essure is FDA approved and has been in use for over 5 years. Essure is not reversible, may not be suitable for all women, and there are risks. Visit Essure.com or call 1-877-ASSURE-5 to find an Essure certified doctor near you.
Permanent, quick, cheap to make, That sounds really convenient for Bayer. And I do not like the sound of that irreversible part at the end. I'd like an objective opinion. How about a show literally called The Doctors?
The Essure is very effective. It's 99% effective. It's been out for 5 years. It's FDA approved.
4 out of 4 doctors recommend Essure because 4 out of 4 doctors are completely full of shit. Just kidding. They're full of Bayer money. Now let's hear from an actual Essure user.
Have you ever had any surgeries?
I had a medical device that broke, leaving fragments everywhere, which set off a connective tissue disorder that started deteriorating my joints.
Holy crap.
Yeah.
Sorry, but that's like...
I love how the nurse is telling her how fucked up her life is. Your job is to tell me how to fix the fuck up. Now, I know what you're saying. Eric, what does this have to do with Nazis? Earlier I told you about the Bayer Nazi experiments that were the foundation of medicines we still use today, such as chemotherapy and HIV drugs. Bayer also did sterilization experiments during the Holocaust. Here is a quote from the 6 Nuremberg trial documents about one of the Bayer Nazi doctors. Quote, Karl Klauberg developed a system of mass sterilization that consisted of introducing into the female reproductive organs a specifically prepared chemical irritant that produced severe inflammation. Within weeks, the fallopian tubes grew shut and were blocked. Now, Essure from Bayer doesn't have any of the foundations of those Nazi experiments, do they?
Basically, a micro insert, and we have one right here, is placed into the uterus and then into the fallopian tubes. And what happens in the fallopian tubes is the tissue grows over it and forms a permanent blockage. So what happens is that the coils are placed, the tissue grows, and then as you see, it's a blockage, so those little guys, they're not getting by the tubes.
Dang, I did not see that coming. Yes, Bayer sells a permanent sterilization device for women that has its research foundations in the Holocaust. After consumer uproar, not the FDA, Bayer was forced to discontinue sales on the European market last year. But don't worry, you can still get it on the American market until the end of this year. Because why would Nazis want to profit off of sterilizing American women? I'm sure that Bayer will use its company slogan after paying the victims of Essure. Paying is not an admission of guilt. Well, Bayer, I think you should change your company motto from this to this. Now I tell you all this because Jews may have been the scapegoat of World War II, but racism was the scapegoat for greed. A conglomerate of powerful chemical companies known as IG Farben, that later became known as Bayer, had the motivation of greed to commit one of the largest genocides of all time. They profited on the mass death of people. I hope that doesn't continue to happen in America, but American companies' attitude towards greed is Sieg Heil.